I was 13 winters old when the wind sharpened to a knife and our world turned to bone and bread. We lived in a ring of shelters along the curve of a great river, a river that never seemed to sleep, even when I stripped it and made it sing. I remember the sound of its low, shivering groans from under the ice, like a giant animal rolling in its sleep. The groan UPS said the river carried old stories underneath, stories from farther than the eye could reach in any direction. I believed it. It smelled like stone and frost and old wood, and sometimes like fish when the sun grew bold enough to bend its fingers into the current. On clear days, the sky was a hard blue bowl, and it made everyone's eyes look pale and bright. When the wind fell quiet, we could hear reindeer clicking across the crusted snow with their tendon strings, and the foxes who thought themselves invisible sniffing around the midden heaps. But most days the wind was not quiet. It pried at our seams, found the tiny spaces where our clothes did not meet our skin, and crawled down our necks like a cold hand. We wore reindeer, fox, hare, wolf if someone died and left a good pelt, and sometimes mammoth, if the big ones had let us harvest one in the season before. The fur went inwards and the skin outwards, so the soft brushed our bodies and the leather faced the world, and it worked better like that. My boots were tall and tied closed with sinew, and I kept them stuffed with dry grass that I changed every day so my feet would stay warm. If I didn't, my toes would go stiff and not listen to me. That had happened to Tarek once, and his big toe never quite woke up again. Our houses were bones and hides, real ones. Mammoth bones made the strong circle that held everything up. Tusks curved like smiles over doorways, heavy and pale, decorated with little charcoal marks from where the women and men drew good signs on them. Over the bones, we stretched hides of mammoth and reindeer and whatever else the world gave us. The hides were thick and smelled of smoke and fat and sweet old sun. Sometimes I lay on the floor and pressed my nose to the hide wall and breathed deep, and the inside of my head filled with warmth. Inside the house, the smoke gathered like a dim cloud, and there was always a line of light floating where the smoke met the air below. My eyes stung a lot, and my grandmother Uma said it meant the smoke liked me. She said the smoke kept us from coughing worse. She said it kept the bugs away, too, when the warm moons came. She said a lot of things. I listened to most of them, except when she said I couldn't go to the big hunt with the others. I did not listen to that at all. If you ask me how I knew the mammoths were coming that winter, I would say the land told us. We followed the bones of their old trails, shallow cuts in the grasslands, baked in summer and frozen in winter, showing the way the big ones liked to walk. The hills held their scratch marks where tusks had pushed, and the earth under the snow had little cups where heavy feet had pressed down into soft seasons long gone. Someone had seen their breath steaming across the lower flat. Someone had seen the churned up earth where they pulled up old grass and moss and the roots they wanted. Kima, our wise woman, said the clouds told her, and also the birds, and also the sky at night. To me, it looked like the same stars as the night before, and the one before that. But the grown UPS nodded when Kima spoke, and her fingers always smelled like red ochre and fat, and when she hummed the dogs fell asleep. So I didn't say anything. The night we began to plan was a still one. The sky was so clear that the stars looked like they had been hung just above our camp, careful and bright, so we could see them properly. The fire burned low, and the lamps stitched from stone and shell were lit, their little tongues of flame eating at the fat and kissing the edges of our faces gold. I sat near Car, my father, with my knees under my chin and my toes close to the fire. I was trying to keep them from arguing with me in that silent way toes do. Car's hands were steady, long-fingered, full of old cuts and healed edges. He cradled a thrower on his knees, the carved wood polished with bare fat and the smooth work of many palms. It was his father's thrower before him, and I wasn't allowed to use it. I had my own, shorter, wrapped with a strip of fur where I gripped it, and I slept with it under my bedding the night I finished it. This is how it is with tools, when they are part of you, they know how to move with you. Sava, my mother, had a strand of opal fox teeth at her throat that clicked when she laughed. That night, she didn't laugh much. She and the other women sharpened flint edges, long thin blades that fit into slots in bone, held by glue made from birch pitch and patience. They worked by the firelight and their eyes shone like whetstones. I watched the men shape points and foreshafts, and the women twist sinew and thread it through bone needles to mend torn places in warm things. The air smelled like char and hide and the sweet sour tang of glue. Every so often a pop in the fire sent a tiny ember leaping, and it died on the hide floor, leaving a little black kiss. "Look," Carr said quietly, his voice a low rumble. He nodded to a long, smooth ivory piece set near the fire. "From the tusk saved 2 seasons ago. It will be the hook for a new thrower. We do not waste. We remember the one that gave it, always." "I remember," I whispered. I always said it when he said the thing about remembering. Even before I began to remember for real. It felt like the right shape inside my mouth. Kima sat opposite us with a bone in her lap and red pigment on her fingers. She was doodling with the ochre and a little sliver of charcoal, and her lips hummed one of her low songs. She painted a mammoth, of course. The lines curved graceful and true, like she didn't need to look at the bone to see where they should go. When she was done with the outline, she smudged more pigment in the belly and on the head, the way a child smudges something and then sees that it looks better like that. She blew on it gently. The flame shadows crawled over the curve of the elephant in her hands, and I swear it breathed once. Kima glanced up and her eyes caught mine. She smiled so wide at me that her teeth showed, and then she closed her mouth and put her hand flat on the painted shape. "Remember," she said, like she'd heard my whisper. Maybe she had. I tried not to look away. "The best place is the bend by the chalk hill," Tarek said from near my elbow. He had a little gap between his front teeth, and he whistled when he said his S's. He didn't like when I told him. He poked me under the arm with a willow stick and I smacked him without taking my eyes off Kima. "The ice is thinner there," Tarek went on, and the stick poked again. "The river churns under the bend and thins the skin on top. We can make the big one lose its footing. Like a fish on a rock." "We don't want the ice to break," Carr said without looking at us. "We want the ground under the mammoth to become uncertain. Not the water, boy. There are calves sometimes. The calf must live." "Not if the big one charges," said Omek, who had a scar that made his right eye look angry all the time. "If it charges, we must stand. No running. We know this. There is no honor in a child standing if a grown shoulder is nearby," Sava said mildly, with her hand smoothing a strip of hide. "The child must run if the land becomes wild. Leave loud things to the loud ones." I tried to look wide and awake and brave without looking like I was trying. This is not an easy face to make. My sister Laya sat behind my shoulder and braided my hair into little tongues while she whispered about me in a voice that was meant to sound like a breeze but always sounded like Laya. "He thinks he is already a man. He looks at his thrower like it's an extra arm," she teased. I knocked my head backward and pretended to sleep. She tugged my hair and I yelped. Sava glanced over, rolled her eyes, and handed Laya a bone needle. Things quieted after that. We talked through the night and into a middle ground that felt like the time between breaths. My eyes began to drift and then open again. Outside the house, the wind lifted and fell, like a giant sleeping. Kima said she had dreamed of a river white fox that spoke in the voice of a bird, and we needed to hang lines of skin with shells on them across the approach paths, so that when the mammoths came the shells would clack and the sound would be like the fox's voice and make them uneasy but not terrified. We show them we are here, Kima said, tapping the painted bone. We do not steal up, we meet. We do not pretend we are rocks. We are people and we are hungry and we will sing our hunger out loud. People agreed. They began to speak softly to their tools, the way you speak to a shy animal. I drifted to sleep after that and woke with my head in Sava's lap and the taste of smoke on my tongue. She didn't tell me to move. She combed my hair with her fingers and I listened to the sound of flint splitting like ice. Shick. Shick. Each sound was a swallow. The sky was beginning to pale, and I could smell fat warm stew. Uma's laugh bounced through the chill and snagged on everyone's ears. I watched Car's hands, those steady hands, fit another blade into a bone handle and press. The line of his mouth was the same as the line in the hide where light met smoke. For a moment I tried to put my mouth exactly like his. Then I fell asleep again. For 3 days we prepared. We set stones in the snow to mark the careful way the hunters would go. We packed sleds with coiled ropes, and we made the ropes by twisting sinew with our legs straight out and our bodies leaning, so our hips would rejoice when the rope was done. We gathered brush and thin dead sticks and dried dung and old bones that would burn, and we carried them to the places where we thought we would need fire. There were not so many trees where we lived that winter. The river gave us thicker things sometimes, driftwood with smooth skin, polished by distance and water, but mostly we burned what we could. I used to think mammoth bones wouldn't catch, because bones are solid like rocks. They burn well, though. They burn hot and fast, and the smoke smells sharp. On the 4th morning, the sky was white as scraped hide and the river wore a skin of light. I woke with my heart thudding, and I expected had been thudding all night, because I had dreamed the mammoths had stood around our house like a ring of breathing hills, looking at me with eyes as big as lamps. When I stepped outside and my lashes froze together for the first 2 blinks, I took it as a sign. I saw my breath and caught it in my hands like I was trying to hold it still. It wriggled away like a fish. I laughed at the foolishness of a breath pretending to be caught. Then I stopped, because it was cold. It wasn't the kind of cold that pushed you, it was the kind of cold that held onto you with both hands and looked you in the eye. "You're all legs," Laya said, following me out. She hit me on the shoulder and I pretended to be knocked sideways. "No one will see you in the grasses when the green moons come." "I am a shadow," I whispered. "I am the space between the grasses." "You are a mouth," she said, and pushed me back inside so Sava could wrap an extra tie of fur around my throat. Sava kissed the top of my head in the space where my hair makes a little swirl. She had done that since I was a breath with bones and a heart. Car tied my belt tight and tucked my knife in the right place. He gripped my shoulder and squeezed. It meant do not be foolish. It also meant I see you. Ash and Drook, our dogs, skittered around our boots. Drook's tail could beat a song on a drum, and his paws were so large he left prints like a small bear. Ash was not named for the fire but for the gray smear he looked like when he was born. Now he was a sway-backed, clever-faced thing who liked to dance directly where you wanted to put your foot next. They were old, but their eyes were bright and their noses were better than anyone's. We tied them with soft hide leashes and told them important things. "No pulling unless we say," I whispered into Drook's ear. He licked my cheek and sneezed in my hair. Ash squinted at me like he understood too much and then decided to forgive me for making him wear a fur collar. Omek and Kar and Sava and me and Tarek and Laya and my grandmother and Kima and all the others, 27 of us, walked out across the crust of the world. We left 7 behind in the houses, to tend the fires and make sure the place remembered we were coming back. The old men said silent greetings to the sky and tied little bits of hair to the shell strings Kima had made so they'd sing our names as well as the foxes. The young men laughed like they weren't afraid. The grown women checked each other's belts and hoods and foot wrappings and padded bags and made sure the lamps had wicks. The watch children carried small bags full of stones that made good sparks, and long sticks with little flame teeth at the end. We walked in a line and then we spread out, and the land opened and closed around us. There are sounds you only hear when you walk with 27 people who learned walking from the same place. The crunch and hush of the snow under us, the stamp and lift, the little breath noises, the soft talk. The clack of shells when we passed the lines Kima had hung. The distant calling of birds who like the cold. The sudden scurry scratch when a hare broke out of a snow nest. The deep, important silence when we stopped and pressed our eyes to the world and asked it to tell us what it had hidden. We found the first sign near a patch of willow where the bark made good tea. Mammoth droppings, frozen solid and stacked like a little hill. I could see the frozen bits of grass like straw in a bear's winter bed. Drook and Ash lifted their noses and wagged their tails very carefully, as though they were greeting someone important. The droppings had a smell, even in that cold. Not a bad smell. A real one. Earth and eaten things and the beginning of something older. Car's mouth pulled to one side the way it does when he is thinking. He crouched and looked at the trampled crust beyond the willow stand and then made a face like he was tasting something good. They passed 2 sleeps ago, he said. Slowly. Where did they sleep? I asked. My voice made its own little cloud and then hid behind Sava's shoulder. Car tilted his head toward the river bend. Where the ice breathes, he said. They like it when the air runs under them. Keeps the little biters away. I pretended I'd known that, because I like to think I'm a hunter. But Uma saw my face and laughed and pinched my ear and gave me dried berries from the pouch she kept hidden in her belt wrap. You know it now, she said. That is the same as knowing it always, unless you use it wrong. We set ourselves into the places Kima and the others had decided. We pushed brush where the ground dipped, left it loose to masquerade as a small piece of the world that had always been there, not a thing we had placed with hands and intentions. We set our shell strings to whisper and clack, we set our little stacks of ready tinder, and then we let the air settle again so we were not the newest smell in the story. It took a long time. Waiting always takes more time than doing. Tarek poked me in the arm with the same willow stick and whispered about bears that wore human skins and lived in trees and dropped out of them onto unsuspecting reindeer. I snorted so hard that my breath put frost on my lip, and then I licked it and made a face and we laughed into our sleeves. Kima walked through our line of crouched bodies and painted a touch of ochre on each of our foreheads with her thumb. The paste was cold and smelled like rust and clay and maybe a little like blood, but Uma says that's just the old memory in your nose talking. Kima sang a low gliding line, something between breath and voice, and the hair lifted on my arms under my furs. She touched my brow last. Her hand was warm. You will listen, she said just to me, and her eyes were full of a thing I wanted very badly to keep. You will know what to do. I will, I said, because what else does a person say to that? But my chest went tight and I wanted very much to run and climb into the space under the hides in the house and press my face into the smell of Sava's hair and sleep. We heard them before we saw them. Not loud. Not the way you'd think. A sound like a hand passing over a drum skin. A sound like many feet pressing and lifting, a slow breath that belonged to the land itself. I thought I saw the ground quiver in the smallest way. The first long hair slid into sight between two low bushes, and then the whole of the thing followed, and there it was, the matriarch, the big mother with the broken tusk. Then another, large but not as large. Then the young ones, their coats darker and their ears furring with frost. Then a slim bull with ragged hair and marks on his shoulder, and Car's eyes tightened at the corners because he was counting and judging and choosing like a hunter must. We do not take the mothers with calves. We do not take the largest ones, not unless they demand that it be them. We do not take a herd. We ask which one will feed us, and then we bring ourselves to the ask. That is what Kima says. Sometimes Kima is a story all by herself. But this part I knew like I knew the taste of clean snow and the sound of my own breath. The matriarch lifted her head and the bottom of my stomach fell away into my boots, because her eyes were not like what I had imagined. They were kind, almost, and clever, and full of a sort of old sadness, even though it was a clear day and the snow had the blue light running in it, and nothing in that moment was sad. She looked straight at us. We were behind brush and hides and we thought we were so clever. She looked straight at us. Then she blew out a breath that made a roll of mist and stamped her foot, and we all felt it in our ribs. She moved a little to the left, and the herd flowed like river water in the same direction, and I saw the thin bull hesitate. He liked to disagree, I could tell. I felt brotherly toward him for a moment that came and went like a blink. Car lifted his thrower. The line of his shoulder matched the horizon, and his feet made a little triangle that mirrored the shape of the bones in our walls. He did not throw. Not yet. Omek lifted his. Sava's hands were near her throat on a cord that tied to a bundle of little charms Laya had made. It was a bunch of tiny bones from a fish and a hawk's ankle and the nub of an elk's antler tip and 3 red stones that looked like berries. Kima stood with her hands on the painted bone in her pouch and whispered to it, and maybe to us. I shifted a little, I couldn't help it, and the snow under my foot squeaked, and Ash's ear twitched. He looked at me like I had dropped a pebble in a still pool and dared it to ripple. The shells clattered softly as the herd flowed toward the bend. The sound made the young ones lift their heads and flick their ears. The matriarch stepped forward with purpose. Purpose has a shape. It looks like nothing else. She crossed toward the thin ice where the river ran fast underneath. The wind shifted and I felt the cold on my right cheek, and I knew the mammoths could smell us clearly now. Omek made a low sound in his throat. Car lifted one finger. The slim bull, the one with the shoulder scars and the sullen eyes, eased away from the side. He didn't like being told where to put his feet. He wanted to test the space I stood in, to see if it would give. He drifted toward the edge where the shells were thicker and the brush piled oddly and the snow was not quite perfect. He noticed. He tossed his head and made a noise and looked at the others, like, "Are you seeing this?" The matriarch turned her head, and the whole world became a thin thread between now and later. The line of us rose up like a ridge of shadow sprouting arms. We began to shout, not the wild shrieking shouting of fear but the long, deep-chested calling that let everything around know that we were here and we meant what we meant. Drook barked and then caught himself and made a low growl instead, like a burr in your glove. Ash did not bark at all. He narrowed his eyes and moved like smoke. Tarek started clacking his shells together in a rhythm that made the hair at my neck stand up. He always had good drum hands. We stepped and waved our fire sticks and shook the brushes tied to bones that we used to make our arms look longer. The big ones bunched and then flowed, bunched and then flowed. The matriarch led them forward, over the place where the ice thinned. It sang a little, a long metal smooth sound from deep, deep down. The slim bull balked, and his feet skidded, and the river opened its mouth to hum at him in a tone that your bones could hear and your ears could not. Now, Omek said through his teeth, and Car through. It is a strange thing to watch a throw when you have done so many throws yourself, because your body wants to do it too, and your muscles jump under your skin with the memory of motion. Car's spear flew clean. The thrower made the sound it makes when the world is right, that little snap thrum. The spear arced and did what it always does, the thing it was made to do, the thing we prayed and worked for. I saw Omex do the same. More spears rose and went like birds. The slim bull made a sound that was not loud but was very big inside, a groaning laugh that made the hair on my arms try to leave. He stumbled and slipped and his hind legs went in two different directions and he went down onto one knee. He heaved up again and swung his head and the world tasted like metal and stone. Car took 3 long steps and lifted his thrower again to finish the work, and that is when the thin edge of the river world decided to play a trick on him. His foot found the place where drifted snow hides a dip. He dropped a little, and he put his hand out to catch himself, and he put it on a rock that was not there. His feet went out from under him and he struck the ground hard along his ribs and the thrower flew from his hand and skittered into a patch of loose brush. I shouted without wanting to and Lia swore in a way Sava would have turned her head for if she'd heard. Car tried to rise at once, but his face did a thing like the fire had leaped out and smacked him. He stayed half up and then sat down like the world had asked him nicely to do it. The slim bull took that moment to turn. He pushed up onto all fours and did a small, desperate dance on the ice, flinging chunks and powder, and then he found a place where his feet grabbed again. He swung his head so fast the air made a sound, and his eye caught Car's little movement, and he charged. The sound a charging mammoth makes is not what you think. It is not like thunder. It is like the earth sucks its breath in behind your rib cage and then tries to blow you over. I did not think. I do not tell this as a way to make myself tall. I did not think. I ran. Time is strange in moments like that. It became slow honey and fast wind all at once. My legs knew the ground the way a fish knows the water it was born in. I slid and cut sideways and felt my boots grip and lift. The thin places in the ice hummed like the throat of the winter sky. I felt the wind from the bull's head sweep past the edge of my hood and pluck a hair from my eyebrow. I saw Ash's tail go low and his body become a line and his paws blur. I saw Car's eyes, wide and unmovable and filled with both love and a sort of fury that I had forgotten my place. I heard the clack of Tarek's shells go fast and unsteady and then find the rhythm again like a heartbeat falling back into its song. I did not aim to strike with my spear. I aimed to draw. To pull. To throw my thrower and make the spear fly the way a fish flies when it leaves the river and shocks itself with the cold air and makes a hawk blink. I threw for the big, dark shoulder, the place where a patch of hair had a different lay from a healed scrape. The throw felt good. Clean. My hand knew the thing it had done all those days I had stood on the edge of camp and whispered to myself about being quiet and true and part of the straight line between me and the world. The spear did not find the place that would make a hunter proud in the way that hunters like to be proud. It struck high and a little back, and I was already running left again, trying to draw with my body as well as my thrown thing. The slim bull's head snapped toward me, and his torso made the small turn that follows ahead without wanting to, and his 4 feet found the place where the river skin grew thin and uncertain. He went down onto one knee again. The ice arrayed itself into white shards like the inside of a shell picked up by a child on a summer shore. He pushed, and his hoof sunk a little, and when he threw his weight forward the skin dented and then held and then tore. He did not break through. He did not need to. He slipped sideways in a slow, terrible grace and came down on his shoulder with a long sigh like the world exhaling. There is a knife edge in moments like that, and we were on it. We moved in with purpose. We moved in thankful and fearful and bright with the knowledge that we were small and quick and many and hungry. The slim bull tried to rise, but his leg had gone wrong in the fall. We did what we had to do, and we did it fast, and we spoke to him as we did it. Kima's voice wrapped around the edges of the world like a blanket. She thanked him for his breath. I thanked him for my father's breath. I will not speak the other sounds. They were not terrible, but they were big, and the world is already full. We did not make a mess of things. We were as clean as we know how to be, and the river breathed in and breathed out and kept on with the life under its skin. After, we stood with our hands on our thighs and our heads bent and our chests moving like bellows. Ash leaned his shoulder against my leg and trembled once and tried to pretend it was the cold. Druk drank snow like water and then sneezed it all back out in a spray that landed on Tarek's fur collar. Tarek yelled and then laughed at himself. I went to car and stood in front of him. He had his arm wrapped tight around his ribs and his face was strange. He looked at me a long time like I was a picture on a cave wall drawn by someone he knew and liked but hadn't seen in a while. Then he put his hand on the back of my head and pulled me in and put his face in my hood and breathed. He smelled like smoke and sweat and winter. You ran when I told you not to, he said into my hair. I ran because the world asked me, I said into his throat. My voice shook a little and I was angry at myself for it. I know, he said, and he squeezed once, his big finger bones pressing the air out of me just enough to make my chest remember that breathing is a thing you must do. I know. We lit the fires we had made piles for. We warmed our hands and our faces and we warmed our gratefulness and we warmed the air so the spirits would smell that this was a good space with good things happening in it. We skinned and cut and wrapped, our blades shining fine and sharp and fast. We had practiced for this. We never wasted the parts the world took such trouble to make. The meat went into hide bags and onto sleds. The fat we saved for lamps and for rubbing into our tools and into our hands. I rubbed a little into my hair and Laya laughed and told me I looked like an old man's mittens. The bones we kept for building and burning and for making things to play notes and draw lines. I cut a little strip of hair from his side and tied it in my belt. It was soft under my fingers like it wasn't supposed to belong to such a large, heavy animal. Kima smeared a line of ochre on the bull's head and kissed her fingers and touched them to her forehead and then mine. Remember, she said, and her mouth bent in a shape that made my chest full. By the time the sun found the low point in the sky that tells you to hurry home, we had 2 sleds full and another half. We had to leave part of him on the river's edge. It burned in me to do it, but even 27 cannot carry a hill of breath and muscle and bone in one go. We would come back loud the next day and finish quickly. We set stones in a circle around what we left, and Kima tied more shells there and spoke a sound to them, and Druk sat on his haunches like a little old man and looked very serious and then farted. Tarek laughed so hard he had to lean on his spear. The world was heavy and it was also still full of silly things. I liked that. We hauled the sleds back. You never notice how far you've walked until you have to pull a hill behind you. My boots made grooves, and my shoulders found new ways to complain. The dogs took turns tugging, and I kissed Ash's head when he leaned into the ropes, and he sneezed again and shook it off like he hadn't just done a good thing. My breath made little puffs and then bigger ones, and the wind did its constant business with the hairs around my face. The shells clacked tiredly like they were asleep and dreaming about waves. The camp watched us come and began to sing before we reached the circle of bones and hides. It made me feel tall. It made me feel small. People poured out of the houses and put hands on the sled ropes and pressed their eyes to the meat and smelled it. Hungry eyes do a thing you recognize, even if you are not their kin. The old ones nodded. The very tiny ones shouted sound without words and stamped their little feet and fell down and got up and fell down again because boots are hard when you are new. Sava held the rope near me and smiled like the sun had decided to live behind her teeth. Car walked at her other side, slow but steady, and he didn't try to hide it when he put his hand on his ribs. He had already told Kima he would do the bad breath herb and sleep sitting. He had already told me I would take his place tomorrow and keep my head like a man. He had not yet told Sava he had slipped. I kept my mouth shut because I wanted to live. That night we steamed fat and water and made a broth that tasted like we had dug up the belly of the warm season and stirred it with a stick. We put stones in the fire to heat and then we dropped them into the pot and let them hiss, and we laughed when they shouted because that is what you do with small, silly, safe sounds. The smell ate every space that wasn't full of smoke. People leaned in too far and got their noses steamed and made the noise you make when a fishtail slaps your thigh. Uma smacked my hand when I sneaked a hunk of meat too soon, and then she handed it to me anyway because she is like that, hard and soft in the same hand. We stirred and we told the story we had just lived and we added parts to it so it would feel good in the telling and the hearing and the memory later. Car sat near the fire and let Kima smear a paste over his ribs. It smelled like bitter leaves and cold ashes and it made my mouth water for reasons I do not understand. Kima covered it with a warm skin and tied it in place and told Sava to keep him from laughing and singing and arguing and he nodded like he was the sort of person who could do that. Omek gave me a look that might have been respect with a very worrying little edge of we must speak later. I avoided him very carefully. Lai rubbed my hair with tallow and braided it tight and put a tiny bead of bone against my scalp, for luck and for the tendons in a wrist. I am not superstitious, she said, which is something superstitious people say when they mean they will not admit it. Kima carved something into a strip of mammoth rib with a flint blade and her thumbnail. When she was done, she blew on it and put it in my hand. It was a shape of me, the line of a boy with a short thrower, his legs long because in her head that is what stands out about me. My chest nearly deepened my breath enough to make me cough. I will make one for the mammoth and keep it with his hair, I said quickly, because the feeling was too much. Kima nodded like I had done what I was expected to do and patted my face with the back of her fingers. Everyone ate so much that the world grew quiet. It is a good quiet when the mouths are full and the eyes go soft and no one is counting inside their head anymore. We went to sleep with warm bellies and warm feet and warm faces. The house looked like a place inside a dream. Firelight climbed along the tusks and the bones and made stupid little jokes with the shadows that popped out and danced on our cheeks. I fell into sleep like a stone into a clear pool. The dream was not what you might think. It wasn't the mammoth speaking with a human mouth or a man with antlers offering me a burning stick. It was a simple thing, a circle of standing stones on a hill, the wind shaking the grasses, the river slipping like a snake under the sky, and a figure at the edge of that circle, very small and very still. The figure lifted a hand and waved me over as though to say, "It is time." When I came close, I saw that it was me. He put his hands on my shoulders and looked into my eyes and did not say anything for a long time. Then he said, very plain and in my voice, "Listen," and the wind lifted and the grasses made a sound like talking. I woke with my heart beating slowly and steadily, like a drum tuned just right. We went back to the river at first light with the sleds and more ropes and the old ones who knew where to put a foot when the ground lied. Wolves had come to our circle of stones. They had left their prints and a little frost breath on the air. We found their marks and we welcomed them with our eyes because they are kin in their hunger. We shouted and we sang and we scared them away, and then we worked fast. Car watched with his hand on his ribs. He made a face like a man who wants to do and is doing the watching instead. It is a hard face to wear. Sava kept him distracted by telling him about the time he fell into the cooking pit when he was a young man and pretended he meant to do it and came out with his eyebrows gone. He groaned and smiled anyway. By midday, the sleds were heavy with the last of what we would bring for now. The bones we left we marked with shells and strings and chemis paint. I tucked a small bone in my belt and did not let Laya see me do it, and then I did let Uma see because she always sees and I wanted her to know I remembered. On the way back, the wind pushed hard and thin clouds scudded across the sky like birds that had forgotten how to fold their wings. My cheeks went stiff and my eyes watered and the world turned into a bright smear. I blinked and shadow shapes flowed like fish in bright water. I thought, snow. I thought, the sky uses its teeth today. I pulled harder and wondered if the weather would turn ugly. The weather turned ugly. It was not the worst storm I have ever seen. It was the kind that thinks it needs to shout so you will look at it, and then when you look, it keeps shouting because it thinks you did not hear. The snow.